This is the world according to Jen and Carolyn.
All right, everybody, coming at you this week with a pretty interesting and controversial one. I think most folks know that Jerry Springer passed away last week. And, you know, if you grew up in the 90s, then you know just how popular the Jerry Springer Show was. Who can forget the screaming, the fighting, the Jerry chanting, and of course Steve, the loyal bodyguard, who tried to maintain peace amongst the chaos and turmoil that made the show great. So, you know, we're going to be paying tribute, but also really critically analyzing this daytime TV icon. And as always, you know, we got to look at this through a psychological angle to really try to determine what made this show must-see TV. So, you know, if you grew up in the 90s like we did, the 90s were wild as hell when it came to a lot of shit, but especially daytime TV. And if you were homesick from school in like 1995, this would have been your trash TV lineup. We had Geraldo. We had Oprah. We had Montel Williams, Jenny Jones, Donahue, Sally Jesse Raphael. Who can forget the Maury Povich Show, Ricky Lake, and the reason why we're here today, Jerry Springer. Carolyn, what was your favorite daytime talk show?
Well, I was definitely raised by oodles of daytime TV and soap operas, and I loved all the pop icons you mentioned, but the light of my life, the OG herself, Joan Rivers.
Oh my God, Joan is, for me, like a comedic icon. And also being, you know, coming up when she did, when women were considered not funny, she blew crowds away.
Yeah.
Like she's just
I really
amazing.
liked her.
Oh, I get chills just thinking about Joan. R.I.P. Joan. But we're going to be talking about Jerry and how he became the king of trash TV with a heart of gold. Now, when I was researching how Jerry grew up, I didn't know any of this stuff.
Me either.
Fascinating upbringing. And I think it explains a lot of why he kind of became who he became. So I didn't know this, but Gerald Norman Springer was actually born in England in 1944, and his parents were Jewish German refugees. They lost a ton of family in the Holocaust. I think he was born in like a bomb shelter or something crazy like that. It was
pretty intense for him, and he had a big connection to that, and he talks a lot about it in interviews.
Yes, and so him and his family moved to Queens, New York when he was about 4 or 5. He got his bachelor's degree from Tulane. He got a Juris Doctorate at JD from Northwestern. So Jerry was clearly highly intelligent. And fun fact, he was actually a political advisor to Robert F. Kennedy when he was running for president. Jerry has, you know, and always was a long-time Democrat. And so he ran for Congress himself in 1970, and he actually came close to unseating the Republican incumbent. He was elected to the Cincinnati City Council in 1971, but resigned in 74 after admitting to soliciting a prostitute. He came clean at a press conference. Nonetheless, he served as mayor in 1977. A lot of cities have the rotating mayor, right? If you're on city council, everybody gets a turn as mayor subsequently. So like South San Francisco, the city I grew up in, has that. Yeah, it's interesting. So, and I forget what it's called. I should know this after all of my Democratic training. And in 1982, Springer actually sought the Democratic nomination for governor of Ohio. TV commercials for Springer's campaign referenced his use of a check to pay a prostitute, saying that he was not afraid of the truth, even if it hurts. So he was embracing the controversy. Jerry has never shied away from controversy, that's for sure. And the Jerry Springer Show, as we know it, debuted on September 30th, 1991. And it actually started as a politically oriented talk show, a longer version of Jerry's commentaries. His guests included Oliver North, Jesse Jackson, and topics. I really can't talk today.
It's not your fault. It's not your fault.
It's not my fault. Topics included homelessness and gun politics. We were talking about this, and I remember when Jerry was a serious show. I remember learning about the affliction, the disease progeria, which is an advanced, rapid aging disease that impacts children. So Jerry used to talk about some really serious topics, but then the change came in 1994, and this is the Jerry Springer Show that we all know and love or hate. right. So in 1994, Springer and his new producer, Richard Dominick, revamped the show's format in order to garner higher ratings. The show became more successful as it became targeted toward tabloidish sensationalism, right?
Yeah.
This is
like
what
American
people want.
That, right?
Yep. Guests were everyday people confronted on a television stage by a spouse or family member's adultery, homosexuality, prostitution. This is not a word I agree with. Transvestitism. Really, it's being transgender. But I pulled this from some antiquated stuff. That's what it was called in the DSM, and that's what it was called in 1994. So I'm using 1994 language here, guys. Hate group membership or other controversial situations. These confrontations were often promoted by scripted shouting or violence on the stage. The show received substantial ratings and much attention, and by 98, it was actually beating Oprah in many cities, reaching 6.7 million viewers. Jerry and his producer, they were giving the people clearly what they wanted.
Yeah.
Okay. And so we actually last weekend went down the rabbit hole watching some old Jerry Springer episodes. It felt
really icky.
It did. It absolutely did. So, here are some of the most outrageous Jerry moments according to a Guardian article. So one, there was a dude who married his horse. We actually watched this.
That got pulled off a lot of networks.
I bet it did.
And a lot of their, I read an article that a lot of their advertising wouldn't participate. Well, bestiality's, be where you are with most things.
Yeah.
I hope most people are really anti-bestiality.
It's not a fetish that we encourage.
I don't want to do a podcast about that. Let me just say that right now.
We're not
learned that in school, and I was like, I feel this is making me very uncomfortable.
We're not delving into interspecies erotica, but Jerry claimed, this is an interesting aside, Jerry claimed to know nothing about, or very little about, the people coming onto the show. And when the horse got trotted out, he was like, oh, we need to take a pause. His wife fell off the horse. And the producers were like, no, that is his wife. Boom. Whether or not that's actually valid in the way it happened, I still find it fascinating.
Wow.
Then we watched this one as well, the Kung Fu Hillbilly. David, a self-identified hillbilly who learned Kung Fu from watching action movies in his VCR. This is like Uncle Rico from Napoleon Dynamite. When it comes time to defend himself from his roommate, Lil Wayne. No, not the Lil Wayne we're thinking of. His karate chops don't prove as effective as he would imagine. Yeah, of course, a fight ensues. 3, there was a sex worker who loses her teeth. A woman purporting to be a sex worker gets into a fist fight and manages to lose her dentures in the process.
Oh my God.
We watched that too. Mother-daughter domination. Whoa. Mother-daughter dominatrix team, which doesn't seem that kinky. It does.
Yeah, I know.
Thanks, Guardian, but I'm going to go ahead and disagree here. That's some weird ass shit. Until they bring their slave out on stage and ride him around like a miniature pony and wait until his wife shows up to browbeat him in front of the crowd. There was the 5th one is breaking the sex record. A woman named Annabelle Chong had sex with 251 men. You go, girl.
I remember that episode.
In 10 hours. Yeah, that's pretty amazing. But then it was even crazier when he had Jasmine St. Clair on the show. She had sex with 300 guys in order to break the record. Wow.
Ow.
And this to me was the most wild, and we watched it. There was a woman who cut off her own legs with a power saw.
No.
Oh, yeah.
No.
Oh, yeah. You must have been really high when we watched this stuff. Or you may have fallen asleep. The soothing sounds of Jerry Springer put you to sleep when we were watching
Why
this.
Why would you want to watch that?
Because it's like a train wreck. We're going to go. You don't need to ask why. You did all the psychological research that we're going to go into, which is actually brings me to my question. When it comes to content like this, we often use the analogy of a train wreck from which we cannot look away. So, Carolyn, what about this? It makes. Why are we so entertained?
Yeah,
are you not entertained?
No, I'm not. I'm. It to me, a lot of this is kind of. It's either makes me want to laugh because I'm uncomfortable, or I find it grotesque. And I think this leads into my thought where it depends if you think there's any redeeming social value in this form of escapism, which is what it is. And when you let's be honest here, Jen, when we look back through history, the Greeks and the Romans fed Christians to the lions and watched gladiators beat each other up for public sport. P.T. Barnum and Bailey had, quote, freak shows. 19th century public executions. We are creatures that look, there's a rule you can't rubberneck and look at accidents on the side of the road.
But everybody does.
Everyone does. And even as simple as a horror movie. You love horror movies. I cannot watch them. I don't want to see it. So what we're looking at is escapism and basic human curiosity. Mm-hmm. And philosopher and psychologist William James, 1899, called curiosity, quote, the impulse towards getting better cognition, meaning that the desire to understand what you don't know is intriguing to us. And even, you want curiosity. That's a good thing. But we're it's like when you're watching a horror movie and you're like kind of peeking through your fingers. Yeah. It's like, why am I doing this? Yeah. And there's a thrill.
And it's going to impact you or has the potential to impact you adversely. Yeah. Yet you cannot look away.
Yeah. And there's this we can go even deeper into your psyche about that. There's a moral superiority and self-esteem issue happening ideologically. This social comparison theory, if you're interested in that, we link it in our show notes. This was developed in 1954 by psychologist Leon Festinger. It's the idea that individuals determine their own social and personal worth based on how they stack up against others. This is what I commonly hear as, I have imposter syndrome. Sorry, I did not mean to downplay that if you have it. But, it's normal to kind of look around you and go, hey, I'm going to size myself up against this person. Am I better? Am I superior? Are they not? Yeah. So in other words, people feel better about themselves when they're encouraged to make self-comparisons with people worse off or lesser, and crazy sells. And Springer created this polarization, and you would find yourself taking a side. This is weird. This is wrong, but I'm still going to look because what is this all about? And society loves to see humanity's oddities on display and maybe even have that mirrored back to them to create that sense of, well, at least that's not my life, you know, right? And there's a psychology and the safety of being able to point your finger at someone else rather than yourself. And my 6th grade teacher used to say, whenever you point your finger, there's 3 pointing back at you.
Ooh, I like that.
I know, right? I was like, cool, dope, Mr. Morris. He did some other weird shit though. But, so this is that subculture that is often created in the internet as well. And if you listen to our last podcast on incels, there's this, what Springer did though, that I find really interesting is this was in public, real people not only reacting, but commenting and then either getting audience support or audience hatred back. Yeah. But usually the audience was projecting negativity or support in unison with whoever was on the stage.
Right, which was being encouraged by the producers. Yes. Like it's theatrical. Yeah. And it's deliberately theatrical and deliberately loud and chanting. And it to me, it did really mimic the Colosseum in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. And the Greek chorus. And, I often found when I'd watch this and a lot of his shows that were more serious, like I remember watching Nazis and KKK members. Yes. For the first time as a 2nd grade Jewish girl and having this awareness and being shocked, like, wait, there's people that hate Jews? Right. Yeah, they didn't teach us that in temple school.
No, well, I mean, you learn about Germany, you learn about the Holocaust, but you're not always made aware of the anti-Semitism that's alive and well. Yes, today.
That was in the past. And I remember going to my parents and going to school the next day and being like, did you guys know this shit? Yeah. And, I think what Springer maybe wanted us to find was some compassion for people who are, living these lives and living this situation and maybe seeking out support, but I don't think that's always what happened.
No, definitely not. And there's a lot of people out there who weren't necessarily sad to see Jerry depart from the earth. And a lot of those folks are members of the LGBTQ community, particularly the trans community, because there's a lot of criticism of the show, particularly around the treatment of trans women, especially trans women of color. So trans women, as well as allies, spoke out on Twitter after Springer's death was announced about how much he and his treatment of trans people affected their sense of self-worth. And they pointed out that his show was often some pointed out that his show was often some of the only trans representation they saw in popular culture when they were younger, for better or for worse. And so Alejandro Caraballo tweeted, "I don't think anything else kept me in the closet longer than the way Jerry Springer sensationalized trans people into a mockery for profit. This isn't ancient history. He continued to do this until this year. I'm not exactly sad to see him pass." There was a lot of sentiments like that. And, although there was another trans woman who commented in response to Alejandra and said, you know, thanks to the Jerry Springer show, she actually knew what trans was and was able to identify. And it wasn't the Jerry show that kept her in the closet. It was her family and her church that made her feel ashamed of who she truly was. But she was actually thanking the show and saying like, hey, I now know what I am. I saw myself in that. And, you know, Jerry pushed back on the accusation of transphobia, and his show and his audience, they always mock trans people when they appeared as guests, including in the offensively named segment, Trannies Twerk It. It's awful.
Gross.
Awful. Presenting one community as a joke in stark contrast to the rest of his show. The online magazine Queerty pointed this out. You know, the laughter, the pointing, the hooting, and the hollering, how can this be perceived as support of the transgender community? This is what Dan Tracer in Queerty, he's the editor, wrote in 2015. And Jerry, in an interview, said, we have transgender people on the show all the time, a lot. In fact, there's probably a lot more exposure on our show than any place else. If the complaint is that the transgender people on our show don't behave well, anyone on our show doesn't behave well. I'll get into it. We hear that from any community. You don't get on our show unless you're doing something that is inappropriate. Our show is about people behaving inappropriately. So, of course, that's going to be. My view has been consistently supportive of the gay community, of the transgender community. I don't take a backseat to anyone in my support of the transgender or J community. Now, personally, I think Jerry is fucking full of shit on this one. I've seen these episodes, and though I have zero right to speak for the trans community or any community for that matter, even communities I am a member of, I find these episodes highly offensive and downright harmful to the trans community. I don't find it cool. Right. You know, and what about the exploitation of other marginalized communities like low-income folks and or people of color? Mm-hmm. Jerry has been criticized, and, you know, I think rightfully so, for doing this. Yeah. Because what he did and what the show did, I think it displayed guests whose behavior serves to perpetuate harmful stereotypes about marginalized populations, people of color, and transgender folks. So
exactly.
Another thing, I need to take a sip of water. Sorry, guys.
Yeah. Well, and there was just no containment.
There was no containment, right? And it was very like the negative amplifications.
Yes.
And the show, this is another thing that I find incredibly troubling. The show definitely seems scripted, which is fine, except that if it's scripted, are the guests actors? And if they are actors, then we aren't talking about people necessarily behaving badly. We're talking about actively perpetuating stereotypes that harm communities. Think about the transgender content. If the trans women depicted are in fact just cis men acting, then they are actively perpetuating the stereotype of the trap, which has actually led to the death of trans women. Trans women get murdered. And so, I see it from that. Now, Jerry claimed the show wasn't scripted. However, there was a Vice contributor, Harmon Leon, I think a lot of folks are familiar with this person, tried to test the show's vetting process by telling the Big Mac of Whoppers, not my words, this is from the article, in a mock bid to get on the Jerry Springer show, he claimed to have a meth-addicted boyfriend who was having too much anonymous sex on Grindr. Allegedly, a producer asked Leon to spice up the story by recruiting a made-up Grindr user before inexplicably chanting Jerry. Overall, Leon likened the show to the WWE. Mm-hmm. So at minimum, there is a push to make real stories more salacious. Yeah. We see that. It was proven time and time again. Now, Carolyn, I have a moral question for you. Should we throw the baby out with the bathwater? Can we appreciate some of Jerry's work, or must we dismiss him completely, especially through, our 2023 eyes compared to where we were in the 90s as a society, as a culture, etc.?
Yeah. Well, my morality as a 40-year-old cisgender white woman, I think the show was really irresponsible, really exploitative, and lacked any dignity. And I'm also actively judging the kinds of people that one would go on there and that would find this entertaining. This is not I can't even really anymore watch, reality TV. My world is filled with reality TV. I don't need it.
Yeah, you're a therapist. You get enough of the good, the bad, and the ugly out there.
And it's the same way that you would look at a minstrel show and things like that were considered entertainment, and look at that through your lens now and go, what the fuck is this? Yeah. And if you're having that reaction, to me, that's a good reaction because that shouldn't be allowed today.
Yeah, you've grown.
It shouldn't have been allowed then, though, but we're often not looking at our behaviors in the moment and thinking about repercussions. That's a very human psychological thing. Hindsight's always 20/20, right? Love is blind. But one thing I do love, Jen, is I love discourse. I love critical thinking, and I love a creative space where people can respectfully have conversations. And that was not this show. You could say, I suppose, that his final thought was this moment of deep reflection, but it lacked closures on how his guests would navigate these issues they were bringing to the show. Didn't include any, I think if we were going to put a kind of 2023 spin on this, you might have that, but you might look at where they come from, what their resources are. The show might say, hey, because this is going on, we're going to set you up with, AA or couples therapy or something like that. So, sociologists often argue that, moral values and, it's normal for us to, like I said, the hindsight issue. But, the idea that I find really troubling in all of this is it wasn't an interview show. Yeah. It wasn't Jerry one-on-one talking with someone. I think that's kind of where you look at a show like Oprah and it had more dignity to it. It had a different tone.
Well, that's how Jerry started.
Right.
And they went the salacious route to get ratings.
Doesn't sell. Yeah. And, I really find Jerry specifically and the studio audience playing this active role in that public degradation and casting the show in this kind of, they weren't having Wall Street couples arguing.
That's right.
So you are... The racism, all these isms that come with the show, I think are true, and you can't deny that. Yeah. But I love this quote, drawing the line in the gutter, it depends how you personally define both the gutter and where the line goes. Yes. So Max Hochult, a professor and philosopher at the University of Alabama, said, this is a fundamental question in ethics. Who makes the rules, God or men? The theological answer is that God makes rules, and the humanistic answer is that men make rules. But the distinction between theology and humanism is this division of moral theory. God makes man, so therefore is man, blah, blah, blah.
Do we have free will? Yeah. We're not going to go down this path.
Yeah, that's a whole nother thing. Yeah. You can take philosophy 101 at any college. Exactly. Right? But I think it's interesting to look at many of the people, like we said, and if you look at academics, I think the people that were having a lot of the say in this are academics, politicians, clergy, and the media. Those really wouldn't be my people that I would look to for moral reality. Yeah. Like, hello, pot, meet kettle. Right. So for better or worse, the show focused on really, I think, what America keeps hidden. It focuses on taboo. Right? These are things that aren't subculture, but they are part of all of us. Yes. It's not taboo to masturbate, but we don't talk about it.
It's our shadow selves on display.
Yeah. So part of the human condition should be critically looking at the past and history with shock and horror. Yeah. What was considered amusing. And I said that's growth, that's maturity, and also looking at the things we think are funny now and going, is that okay? And I think when you and I have been in nonprofit planning and looking at different ideas that we're like, this is great, we're often going, well, okay, but what would a 12-year-old teenager think of this? Absolutely. What would a person of color think of this? And it's important to have those people in the room.
Well, I can almost guarantee you that all the producers were white cis men. Yeah. So making these decisions about how to characterize communities that they're not part of. And very negative characterizations of these communities. Yep. So who's at the table, who isn't at the table when creating content? I think you make a really important point. And I think Jerry made a really illuminating point when he said, when you watch late night television in the US, it's full of wealthy, famous, and good-looking people. And he added, they come on and talk about the exact same things we hear on my show. They talk about who they've slept with, what drugs they've been on, what misbehavior they've had, etc. And we think they're godlike. He says, when someone's not wealthy, not good looking, and doesn't speak the Queen's English, we call them trash. And that's elitist. I think he's got a really good point there.
I like that you had that in there. It's funny. I had that in earlier. Yeah. And I'm glad you make that point because that's true.
America definitely has an obsession with the rich and famous, elevating them for their misbehavior. At the same time, we shit on poor folks for doing the same thing. As long as the packaging is pretty, we approve. Show someone from the deep South with missing teeth and poor grammar with the same problems as like the Kardashians, and they get mocked incessantly. It's
That's
terrible.
true.
Carolyn, can we talk a little bit about you touched on it briefly, the hypocrisy I see here? I see this as a major societal problem applicable not only to the Springer Show, but to our society as a whole.
Well, when earlier I introduced the concept of social comparison theory, and this can motivate people to improve. If I think someone is, in a better station than me, I could say, well, what do they have and how do I get there? But it can also promote judgmental bias and overly competitive, very superior attitudes. And so someone looking at the show might identify and go, oh, that looks like me. Another person might identify with what you and I would say that's racist, or that's bullying, or that's violence, and they're going to identify with that too. So it's so dependent on the perception and the intelligence and all the other factors that go into the person who's watching this. And again, it's fundamental that we question that. And it's an article in a public marketing firm, Dan Martell, says we strive to create a dialogue with our customers. This is such a random thing that I found, but I really loved what he wrote. As we strive to create a dialogue with our customers, we must be aware that the internet is a lot like a bar. Some people, and I would equate this to the talk show, but now it goes towards internet. Some people can handle the freedom and conduct themselves properly, while others are there to pick fights, hit on girls, and harass other people. This is why bars have bouncers. And this is what's going to be the answer in a show like Jerry Springer. What's going to be the answer in social media? Who are the bouncers? Will every discussion require a moderator who's going to be filtering content in real time? And at what point do we start, again, that First Amendment stuff coming up again with this, so, and I thought it was funny because he said, do we need bouncers on the floor of the Senate to keep elected officials from throwing chairs and chanting Jerry, Jerry?
That actually happens more so in other countries than it does here. Like people on the floor of, their version of Congress, whatever, get into physical altercations. We're relatively tame by comparison.
Well, and I think that's what makes people with good reasoning get fired up about this type of stuff, because Americans are fed up with this kind of entertainment and this kind of tone when it's not, when there's no opinion's the wrong word, but there's no divergence into what happens next. Where does it go from here? His final thought was sort of, it had it, but it didn't give me enough to feel good about closure at the end of the show and what was going to happen. They were it's dismissive.
I don't think there's any disputing that the show was about the spectacle. The show was about the behavior. There wasn't, aside from the final thought, which sometimes felt a bit misplaced given the character of the show, the tenor of the show, that's not enough. It almost feels like a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. Like you can't encapsulate what happens, the violence, the vitriol, the mocking, and reduce it to a final thought that's like, kumbaya, everybody, take care of yourselves and each other.
Because there's no way to, how are you holding space and taking care of people once they leave the show and once your guests leave the show?
And I'm glad you touched on that, because again, this goes to the First Amendment, and actually, I want to delve a bit into the responsibility to protect guests, or if that responsibility even exists, especially in light of some of the tragedies that occurred following appearances on the Jerry Springer Show. So this is from a Grunge article. When 24-year-old wife and mother Dawn Marie Eves appeared on the show in 1998, she had an untoward secret to share, an illicit affair with an underage teen. Jesus Christ, you guys. The AP report that a court banned the unabashed offender from seeing the boy and sentenced her to 5 years probation after she outed herself on television. Unwilling to let sleeping crimes lie, Eves met up with him again, prompting her arrest. 2 years later, Springer guest Rolf Jurgen Panitz murdered his ex-wife, Nancy Campbell Panitz, mere hours after watching the episode featuring him and his soon-to-be victim. According to The Guardian, Jurgen Panitz had continued living with his ex after the divorce, despite secretly marrying someone else. Well, I'm having trouble keeping track of this. He chose Springer's show as the venue to drop that bomb, which inevitably caused a blow-up. Campbell Panitz later kicked them out of her home. Jurgen Panitz watched their falling out play out on TV as he got homicidally drunk at a bar.
Cool.
Incensed and intoxicated, he vented by viciously striking and strangling his former life partner. Campbell Panitz's son sued the Springer Show, holding it responsible for killing, but later dropped the suit. This is from a Sky News article. Springer insists that the show had no direct influence on either death, comparing it to suing Walmart because you had an argument with someone in their shop. As for vetting wannabe contestants, he wants to know why TV is subject to such scrutiny while written journalism is not. Springer asks, what would happen if we applied the same rules to newspapers? From now on, you may not write an article about a person without first getting their permission, making sure their marriage won't be hurt, making sure their career won't be hurt, and making sure they won't be humiliated. Again, this is some First Amendment 101 shit. Is this a free speech argument? Of course it is. You know, now is the show inciting violence? I mean, I'd say yes, but to a degree. Jerry and the producers may not be giving the nod to homicide, but there is a total, incontrovertible encouragement of violent behavior on the show, often met with the infamous chants of Jerry, Jerry. So, Carolyn, can we talk a bit about the public? And again, I don't think we necessarily have an answer as to whether or not the show has this responsibility. Yeah. Would we like to see it? Yes. Does it have a legal or even an ethical obligation to go beyond what they did go beyond to protect? Yes. I don't know. That's going to be for you all to decide. But Carolyn, I want to talk a little bit more about the public's fascination with violence and violent programming, video games, etc. And is there a responsibility for extreme violence that we see particularly in mainstream American society associated with this content?
Yeah, and as you're listening to this, what you're going to attach to, I hope, is, well, who is responsible? Who's the ultimate responsible? And we say we're responsible for ourselves. Yeah. But if you're under 18, your family's responsible. That's right. And we talked about this last time. Where does the buck stop, right? But this prevalence of verbal and physical aggression that we see everywhere. Yeah. You can't get away from it. I don't like watching the news because that's what I see. Yeah. And it earned this genre a designation of the term confrontainment.
Interesting.
Which I thought was, again, really fascinating.
I mean, look at how this has changed the American lexicon.
Yeah. What 100% and that's what pop culture does, right? But let's go way back. All right. So the ethical theory of hedonism is this idea of pleasure. And this is Thomas Hobbes. This idea that life is about pleasure and we work hard and we struggle. And so when we want to play, right? And I like that. I subscribe to that for sure. Not necessarily in the term hedonism. But remember when I talked about escapism? Yeah. It's a relief. That's why we like watching sports even. Right. You know, it's a way to get out of your day-to-day and look at someone else's trauma and look at someone else's shit.
Or live vicariously through someone else. Like
Absolutely.
A sports hero.
Exactly. And so I thought research that came out of the University of Augsburg, Germany and the University of Wisconsin in 2013 did a study where they examined whether the serious contemplative and truth-seeking motivations for exposure to violence portrays are more than just an intellectual pleasure. Is there more behind this? And it's not so much that we're actually, Jen, wanting to see violence necessarily. Yeah. We're attracted to the thrill, the suspense, the oddity. I talked about this earlier. And we get to look at and judge, and it's a way to comfort us or soothe us or incite and validate something that we're feeling inside and that we're dealing with in an aspect of our life.
Interesting.
And, you know, these findings suggest that hedonistic pleasures are only part of the story about why we're willing to expose ourselves to scenes of bloodshed, scenes of aggression, and that boosted ratings. As you watch the show's trajectory. It didn't, like you said, didn't start off that way.
Mm-hmm.
By the end, it was constant, almost to the point where you could watch Jerry get frustrated that they couldn't get anything out. It's like, I can't do this.
Well, Jerry said he didn't even watch his own show.
Oh, isn't that fast? It's like
he was
Steve
like,
Jobs doesn't let his kid have an iPhone, right?
He was not interested in that kind of content. He just produced it.
Yeah. And so these types of violent portrayals attract audiences because they promise this satisfying truth-seeking motivations and offering what I would, quote, insightful, but it's an aspect of the human condition that you could see and, feel seen, I suppose, right? But these depictions of violence are perceiving them as meaningful and thought-provoking, and maybe even fostering empathy with the victim.
Yeah.
I don't know that is what most people were doing. I think that would go, you can't say that people weren't. I would feel that. And when I'm watching, I'm going, God, that sucks. That's terrible. These poor people, these poor humans and going through this is awful. But, again, I would look at, people on there and admire them as an act of courage. And this isn't, this is them exposing themselves, but I also go, why would you do that?
Yeah.
And then to be ridiculed.
In such a public venue and in a place where you're going to get ridiculed.
Yes. And so this study was really examining this prevalence of what they call pro-social responses and the conditions under which they occur. And then trying to add this theoretical model to it to explain something, I know, which is, why does a kid want to look at their poop? Because it's weird and it came out of your butt, and you have to learn, like, this isn't appropriate. And are we learning that? Who's monitoring that, right? So I do think, though, that this does lead into a social issue and even a public health issue. And it was highlighted in a 2014 Mount Sinai Medical Research Center article that looked at this impact on the brain. And I get parents all the time who are bringing their kids in and talking about their phone or violent video games and saying, well, this is changing their brains. And that's true.
Yeah.
And this long-standing debate over whether violent movies cause real-world violence is constantly, you're going to see both camps, right? Because you also have someone say, well, they could still turn on the news and see it. Yeah. However, this study found, and it's not rocket science in my mind, that each person's reaction to violent images depends on their individual brain circuitry, how aggressive they were to begin with, and what happened to them. Is this validating behavior or is this disgusting behavior to you? And so it concerns me because we are opening up a door without any containment around the before, the middle, or the after, and the long-term benefits. Why was a second grader watching this at home on non-cable TV?
It's so accessible and to a group of individuals, i.e. children, whose frontal lobes are not properly formed. And also from an adult perspective, when it comes to the Jerry Springer Show, are you going to get folks who look at episodes that feature trans women, for instance, quote unquote, trapping, straight cis men? Are there going to be people who feel sympathy for the transgender woman? Are there people who are going to go out and incite violence against folks in the trans community because of what they're seeing? Yes. It all depends on, what somebody's thoughts are, processes, mental health issues, etc. People are going to perceive these things different. And the problem is that some people will perceive this in a way that galvanizes violent action. But is it the responsibility of the show or the content to make modifications in the instance that this could contribute to this behavior in some folks, not most folks? Yes. And I don't have an answer for that, but I think it's an interesting question.
Well, and look at who the audience was. When we were watching some of those old clips, you would pan out, the audience was mainly, I think, people under the age of 30.
Yeah. And a lot of white people.
Yeah. And, what we do know about the brain is it doesn't fully develop till your mid to late 20s. Yeah. If you haven't had other things happen to you, right? So I don't know. I mean, that makes me concerned.
Yes.
And I think that's why we worry about TV. That's why we worry about anything, because it's actually, but we have to also think more upstream. We're talking about the wrong thing. This is happening in culture. This is happening in society. This is happening not just in America, but globally. And people feel helpless, and if people are fed up or they feel entitled And like, there's just a polarity happening there, and everything to me about the human experience and about everything that we witness in nature is about nuance.
Yeah. And I think we need to place a particular lens on American culture, because I would say that our culture, at least, I think I can unequivocally say we are the most violent culture.
Yes.
We are the most violence-obsessed culture. We are the most gun-obsessed culture. We have mass shootings. That's an American thing, and almost exclusively an American thing. So I think we do have to start making those parallels, right? Making those connections between how violent our society is, whether it's just depictions of violence in media, and how much violence has actually been being perpetrated, and where's the connection, and where do we intercede, and where do we moderate, and what do we do?
It cannot just be, as much as I'm a proponent of free speech and freedom of choice, sometimes we need seatbelts in cars.
For sure.
It shouldn't be your choice, because that's going to impact other people.
That's right.
I don't know. I just, and that's a very polarizing topic for people. You're taking away my right to do things. It's like, but.
Well, it's like with immunizations, right? With the vaccine, people are like, I'm not doing this. It's like, well, it's a public health crisis. One, and two, these vaccines are safe. We are big proponents of vaccines here, folks. And if you're not, we are not the show for you.
Sorry, Tom Cruise, don't yell at us. Or actually do yell at us.
Well, Tom Cruise also doesn't like psychological medication, and we're totally fine with psychopharmacology. So we're not going to get into Tom Cruise or Scientology, but maybe we will do an episode on Scientology, because Jesus, that's weird. Anyway, so in the spirit of, we're going to wrap this up. And again, we don't have any answers. We just kind of wanted to lay all the cards on the table and let you come to your own conclusions. And, in the spirit of Jerry, I think it's time for a final thought. Whether you love him or hate him, whether you find his show to be exploitative or entertaining as hell, or both, there is no denying that Jerry Springer left an indelible mark on not only pop culture, but the entire world. At its worst, the show amplified dangerous and denigrating stereotypes. At its best, it gave a platform to subcultures that were unfamiliar to most people. Again, we aren't here to sway you one way or another, but we can say this: things are often more complicated, more complex, and more convoluted than they seem. If you love the show, ask yourself why. If you hate the show, I encourage you to reflect on why that is. That's our final thought, but we think it's only appropriate that we use Jerry's words to end this episode. Springer delivered the commencement address at his alma mater, the Northwestern University School of Law, in May 2008. Many students criticized the choice of speaker, but he drew a standing ovation from about half of the audience, and reviews of the speech were generally positive, according to an article on law firm marketing agency website 1400.com. In his speech, he declared, "I am not superior to the people on my show, and you are not superior to the people you will represent. That is not an insult. It is merely an understanding derived from a life spent on the front lines of human interaction." Whoa. I know.
Chills.
I know. Jerry, for better or for worse, love him, hate him, etc., he was an incredibly smart and reflective human being. And we know you're all smart and reflective human beings, and will come to your own conclusions around the Jerry Show and how we should feel about it, looking at it through 2023 eyes versus looking at it through 1995 eyes. And I think the answer is, somewhere in the middle, right?
Yeah.
And it's about growth, and it's about reflection and maturity. And if we can deduce nothing else, it's this: society changes.
Yeah.
And we have made a lot of changes for the better. What was acceptable in 1995 is no longer acceptable to a huge group of people out there.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at it through that lens and that perspective.
Yeah.
All right.
I love that. Take care of yourself.
And each other. Jerry. We hope you enjoyed the show. As always, give us good ratings, 5 stars.
Write reviews.
Share. We appreciate you guys. Thanks for listening.
Sure do.
And we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye. Ugh.